The cold wind of the north moved across the hills like a silent warning. Snow covered the ground around Winterfell, and the air felt heavy with the feeling that war was coming. Jon Snow stood on the walls of Winterfell, looking over the land he had grown up protecting. Even though people called him a bastard, the North was still his home. Every tree, every hill, every frozen river felt like part of him. Behind him, he heard familiar footsteps, still watching the horizon like a lonely wolf. Robb Stark said with a small smile. Jon turned and smiled back. Robb looks older than he had just months ago. War had done that to him. The responsibility of leading the North sat heavily on his shoulders, but his eyes still held the determination of a Stark. "I'm just thinking," Jon replied. "Thinking about the war?" Robb asked. Jon nodded slowly. News had arrived from the south. The Lannisters had gathered their armies. The Seven Kingdoms were breaking apart after King Robert's death, and every lord wanted power. But for the North, it was simple. Their father, Ned Stark, had been betrayed and executed in King's Landing. The North wanted justice. Robb leaned against the stone wall beside Jon. "The bannerman will arrive soon," Robb said. Robb said, "Great Jon Umber, Karstark, Mormont, all of them." Jon looked toward the distant forest. "You'll need strong commanders," he said quietly. Robb looked at him carefully. "You're coming with me," Robb said. Jon frowned slightly. "I'm supposed to go to the Night's Watch." Robb shook his head. "Father is gone. Winterfell needs men he can trust, and I trust you more than anyone." Jon stayed silent for a moment. All his life he had planned to join the Night's Watch. It felt like his place in the world. Bastards didn't inherit castles. Bastards didn't lead armies. But Robb's voice was serious. "The North is going to war, Jon," Robb continued. "And I need my brother beside me." The word brother hit Jon harder than the cold wind. Not bastard. Brother. Jon looked down at the courtyard where soldiers were training. Steel clashed, and men shouted orders. "You have experienced warriors," Jon said. "Great Jon Uber alone could crush a man with one hand." Robb smirked. "Yes, but the Gridjon also drinks enough ale to drown a horse." Jon laughed quietly. Then Robb's face became serious again. "I need someone who can think," Robb said. "Someone who knows how our enemies fight." Jon raised an eyebrow. "And you think that's me?" Robb nodded. "You watch. You listen. You don't rush into battle like some of these lords. Father always said a good commander wins before the swords even cross." Jon remembered their father's words well. Ned Stark had taught them honor, patience, and responsibility. But leading armies was different. "You would make me a commander?" Jon asked slowly. "Not just a commander," Ron asked slowly. "Not just a commander," Robb said. "My greatest one." Jon stared at him, surprised. The wind howled across the wall. "Many lords rode like that," Jon warned. "A bastard giving them orders." Robb's voice turned cold like the northern ice. "They will obey," he said, "because I'm the king in the north." For a moment, Jon saw the true strength of Robb Stark. He was no longer just a boy from Winterfell. He was becoming a king. Footsteps suddenly rushed up the stairs to the wall. It was Theon Greyjoy. "You two are hiding up here while the entire north gathers below?" Theon said with a grin. Theon said with a grin. "The Gridjon is already shouting at someone." Robb laughed. "That sounds about right." Theon looked between them. "So what are we planning? Charging south and smashing Lannister skulls?" Jon crossed his arms. "If we rush blindly, Tywin Lannister will destroy us." Theon rolled his eyes. "Here comes the careful wolf." But Robb looked interested. "What do you suggest?" Robb asked. Jon looked south, toward lands he had never seen but knew were filled with enemies. Tywin expects us to attack like angry northerners, Jon said. So, we don't. Robb leaned forward. Go on, we move faster than they think. Split the army, confuse them, strike where they don't expect it. The On blinked. That actually sounds dangerous. Jon gave a small smile. War is dangerous. Robb's eyes lit up with excitement. You see, he said to Theon, this is why I need him. Theon sighed. Fine. The bastard gets to be the clever commander. Jon ignored the word bastard. For once, it didn't matter. Below them, horns began to echo across Winterfell. The northern banners were arriving. The War of the Five Kings had begun, and Jon Snow was about to become something no one in the Seven Kingdoms expected, the most dangerous commander in the north. The courtyard of Winterfell was louder than Jon had ever seen it. Horses neighed, armor clanged, and the banners of the north moved strongly in the cold wind. Direwolves, giants, bears, and many other symbols of the northern houses stood proudly above the soldiers gathering below. Jon stood beside Robb on the wooden platform, overlooking the courtyard. Hundreds of men filled the space. Some were sharpening swords, some were arguing loudly, and others were drinking ale even though the sun had barely risen. The northern lords had arrived. Robb looked calm, but Jon could see the pressure on him. Leading this many warriors was not a small thing. Every lord down there was powerful in his own lands, and many of them were much older than Robb. But today they had come to follow him. Suddenly a loud, booming voice shook the courtyard. Where is the Ewan? Booming voice shook the courtyard. Where is the Ewing Wharf? Jon smiled slightly. That must be the Great Jon. A giant of a man pushed through the crowd. Great Jon Umber was massive, with a thick beard and shoulders as wide as a door. He looked more like a wild bear than a lord. Behind him were Karstark men, tall warriors wearing heavy furs. The Mormonts had also arrived, with Mage Mormont leading them proudly. Robb stepped forward. I'm here, Great Jon. The huge lord looked at him carefully for a moment. Then he suddenly laughed loudly. You's smaller than your father. He roared. Many soldiers laughed. Robb did not look angry, but I planned to fight harder than him, Robb answered calmly. The Great Jon grinned. Good answer, boy. Then his eyes moved toward Jon. And who is this? Before Robb could speak, the Great Jon said loudly, Ah yes, the bastard of Winterfell. The word spread quietly through the crowd. Jon stayed calm. He had heard worse his entire life. But Robb's voice became sharp. Jon Snow, Robb said, my brother and my chief commander. The courtyard suddenly became quiet. Some lords looked surprised. Others looked annoyed. The Great Jon raised one eyebrow. A bastard giving orders to northern lords. Karstark crossed his arms. Strange choice, my king. Jon could feel the tension building. This was exactly what he had warned Robb about. But Robb didn't move. If any man here doubts Jon Snow, Robb said firmly, he may challenge him. Murmurs spread through the soldiers. The Great Jon suddenly laughed again. I like this boy, he shouted. Then he stepped forward and looked down at Jon. Tell me, bastard, he said with a grin. Why should we follow you? Jon walked forward slowly. Hundreds of eyes were watching him. Instead of showing anger, he spoke calmly. Because I don't want Dory, Jon said. The lords looked confused. I want victory. The courtyard stayed silent. Jon continued. The Lannisters have more gold, more soldiers and stronger castles. If we fight them like proud warriors, we will lose. Karstark frowned. Northerners are not cowards. Jon shook his head. I never said we should be cowards. I said we should be smarter. The Great Jon watched him closely now. Jon pointed to the gathered army. Tywin Lannister expects us to march south in one large army. He will prepare defenses and crush us. So, what do you suggest? Mage Mormont asked. John's voice became stronger. We become wolves. Robb smiled slightly. He had heard this plan before. We move in smaller groups, John explained. Fast, quiet, unexpected. The great John rubbed his beard. Go on, rubbed his beard. Go on. We make Tywin chase shadows, John said. While he looks for our army, we strike his weakest places. The northern lords began whispering. John continued speaking clearly. We know the forests. We know the cold. We know how to survive with little food. Southern armies don't. Maege Mormont nodded slowly. He speaks truth. John looked around the courtyard. We are not stronger than the Lannisters, he said. But we are harder to kill. A few soldiers laughed. Even the great John smiled. Karstark still looked serious. And if your clever plan fails, he asked. John answered immediately. Then we die fighting for the north. Silence filled the courtyard again. Then suddenly the great John raised his sword high. The bastard speaks like a straw Northman. The soldiers began shouting. The king in the north, the king in the north, the king in the north. The sound grew louder. The king in the north. The sound grew louder and louder. Robb looked at John and gave him a proud smile. In that moment, many of the northern lords began seeing Jon Snow differently, not as a bastard, but as a commander. As the cheering continued, Jon looked south. Somewhere beyond those hills and rivers waited the Lannister armies. And if his plans worked, Tywin Lannister would soon learn that the North did not fight like Southern knights. The North fought like wolves, quiet, fast, and deadly. And this war was only just beginning. The Northern army left Winterfell 3 days later. The gates of the great castle opened before sunrise, and thousands of soldiers began marching south. Snow crunched under their boots, and the cold wind followed them like a silent companion. Banners moved above the army like waves in the sky. The dire wolf of Stark, the giant of Umber, the bear of Mormont, and the sunburst of Karstark. Robb Stark rode at the front on a grey horse. Beside him were Jon Snow and Theon Greyjoy. Theon looked excited as always. Finally, he said with a grin, "A real war." Jon looked ahead calmly. "War is not a game, Theon." Theon shrugged. "Maybe not for you." Robb smiled slightly but said nothing. His eyes were focused on the road ahead. After several hours of riding, the army stopped near a frozen river. The lords gathered inside a large command tent to discuss the next move. A rough map of the riverlands was spread across a wooden table. Stones and small knives were placed on the map to represent armies and castles. Robb looked at Jon. "Tell them." All the lords turned their attention toward Jon. Jon pointed to the map. "Tywin Lannister's main army is near Harrenhal," he said. "But his son Jaime is leading another force in the Riverlands." Great Jonumber leaned forward. "So we march south and smash them." Jon shook his head. "That's exactly what Tywin wants." Karstark frowned. "You keep saying that." Jon moved a small knife across the map. "If our entire army moves together, the Lannisters will see us coming from miles away." Maege Mormont crossed her arms. "So what do you plan, Snow?" "Show. What do you plan, Snow?" Jon took a breath. "We divide the army." The tent became quiet. Great Jon frowned. "Divide our forces? That's dangerous." Jon nodded. "Yes, but it's also unexpected." He pointed at the map again. "Robb will lead the main force west toward River Run. Jaime Lannister is attacking the castle there." Robb nodded slightly. "And the other force?" Karstark. Jon moved another knife toward a different road. "I will lead a smaller force east." Theon blinked. "East? There's nothing there." Jon smiled slightly. Exactly. The lords looked confused. John explained, Tywin expects Robb to command the whole army. If another force appears somewhere unexpected, he will become unsure. Mage Mormont slowly nodded. You want him to split his own army. John pointed at her. Yes. The Great John began smiling. Oh, I like this plan. John continued. If Tywin moves his soldiers to chase me, Robb will face fewer enemies when he attacks Jaime at River Run. Robb looked around the tent. Two wolves hunting different prey. Karstark still looked unsure. And if Tywin ignores you, John answered calmly. Then I attack his supply lines. The Great John laughed loudly. Starve the lions. John nodded. An army without food cannot fight. The tent became quiet again as the lords thought about the plan. Finally, Mage Mormont spoke. I will ride with John. John looked surprised. You don't have to. The Mormonts follow strength, she said firmly. And you think like a hunter. The Great John slammed his hand on the table. Fine. I'll stay with the young wolf and break Jaime's army. Robb looked relieved. Karstark sighed. This is risky. Robb finally spoke. War is always risky. Then he looked at John. Are you ready to lead men into battle? John thought for a moment. All his life he had been called a bastard. Now he was about to command soldiers of the North. Yes, John said quietly. I'm ready. Later that night, the army split. Robb Stark rode west with most of the northern forces. Thousands of soldiers followed the young wolf toward River Run. John watched them disappear into the snowy distance. Then he turned to his own smaller force. Around 3,000 men waited for his command. Mage Mormont rode beside him. You're nervous, she said. John shook his head slightly. Not nervous. Then what? John looked toward the dark eastern road, thinking. She smiled. Good commanders always think. John raised his sword slightly. Move out. The soldiers began marching east through the cold forests of the Riverlands. No songs were sung, no horns were blown. John wanted silence, because wolves hunted best in the dark. Far to the south, Tywin Lannister sat inside the massive halls of Harrenhal, studying his own war maps. A messenger suddenly rushed into the room. My lord, the soldier said nervously. Scouts report another northern army moving east. Tywin slowly raised his eyes. Another army? Yes, my lord. Led by Jon Snow. Tywin frowned slightly. Jon Snow. Tywin frowned slightly. Jon Snow. He had expected Robb Stark, but a different wolf was now moving across the board. Tywin leaned back in his chair. Interesting. For the first time since the war began, the great lion of the West was uncertain, and Jon Snow's game had only just begun. The cold forests of the Riverlands were quiet as Jon Snow's force moved through them like shadows. The soldiers followed narrow roads and hidden paths, avoiding villages and open fields where they could be seen. Jon rode at the front with Mage Mormont and a few scouts. For 3 days they marched without being discovered. The soldiers were starting to understand Jon's style. He did not rush. He watched, listened, and waited. Every night he spoke with scouts and studied the map by firelight. On the 4th night, a scout returned quickly. My lord, the man said, breathing heavily. We found them. Jon looked up from the map. Where? Where? About 2 miles south, a Lannister supply camp. Mage Mormont leaned forward. How big? Mage Mormont leaned forward. How big? Maybe 500 soldiers. Wagons full of food and weapons. Jon's eyes focused immediately. This was exactly what he had been searching for. Who commands them? Jon asked. A knight named Sir Adam Marbrand. Mage nodded slowly. A good fighter, but careless. Jon stood up. How strong are their defenses? Wooden barricades. Guards posted around the camp, but they don't expect an attack. Jon looked at the map again. This camp was important. The wagons carried food for Tywin Lannister's main army. If those supplies disappeared, thousands of Lannister soldiers would soon feel hunger. May crossed her arm. So, Commander, what's the plan? Jon looked toward the dark forest. We attacked before dawn. Some nearby soldiers looked surprised. 500 men against 3,000, one asked. Jon shook his head. No. He pointed at the camp location on the map. We attack with 300. The soldiers exchanged confused looks. Mage raised an eyebrow. 300. Jon nodded. If we send the whole army, they will see us coming and escape with the wagons. He then looked at the soldiers. But 300 quiet riders can reach the camp before they understand what's happening. Mage slowly smiled. You really do think like a wolf. Jon began giving orders. 200 archers will surround the camp in the forest. When the signal fire starts, they shoot anyone trying to escape. He looked at another group. 100 riders will follow me straight into the camp. The soldier who had questioned him earlier looked nervous. That's dangerous, Jon simply replied. War is dangerous. A few hours later, the northern soldiers moved quietly through the trees. The moon was hidden behind clouds, making the night even darker. The Lannister campfires were visible through the forest. Laughter and voices came from the camp. Some soldiers were drinking wine. Others were playing dice. They had no idea death was creeping closer. Jon raised his hand, stopping the riders behind him. Mayage whispered, Archers are in position. Mayage whispered, Archers are in position. Jon looked at the camp one last time. Light the arrow. A soldier lit an arrow with fire and shot it high into the air. The flaming arrow landed in the center of the Lannister camp. For 1 second, the soldiers looked confused. Then chaos began. Enemies. Jon drew Longclaw from its sheath. Ride! The northern riders burst from the trees like wolves charging from the dark. Hooves thundered across the ground. Jon rode straight toward the center of the camp. Lannister soldiers grabbed weapons in panic, but it was too late. Arrows rained from the forest as northern archers began shooting. Jon cut down the first guard who rushed toward him. Steel clashed loudly. Mage Mormont's axe swung through another soldier beside him. The Lannister camp quickly turned into chaos. Horses ran loose. Tents burned and frightened soldiers tried to escape, but every road out of the camp was blocked by northern archers. Within minutes, the battle was nearly finished. Sir Adam Marbrand tried to rally his soldiers, but Jon rode directly toward him. Their swords clashed under the burning light of the camp. Adam was a skilled knight, but Jon was faster. After a few strikes, Jon knocked the knight's sword from his hand and placed Longclaw against his throat. Yield, Jon said calmly. The knight dropped to his knees. The fighting slowly stopped. Northern soldiers stood among the burning wagons. Maegay walked over to Jon. Well done, Commander. Jon looked at the captured wagons. Burn half of them. Mage looked surprised. Burn them? Yes. The rest we take with us. Soon flames rose into the sky, lighting the dark forest. By morning, smoke from the destroyed supply camp could be seen for miles. Far away in Harrenhal, another messenger rushed into Tywin Lannister's hall. My lord, the supply camp has been destroyed. Tywin slowly looked up. Destroyed? Yes, my lord, by Jon Snow. The old lion remained silent for a long moment. Then he said quietly, Send more scouts. For the first time since the war began, Tywin Lannister was beginning to take a bastard of Winterfell seriously, and this was only Jon Snow's first strike. The smoke from the burning Lannister supply camp could still be seen in the sky as Jon Snow's force moved deeper into the Riverlands. The soldiers marched quickly. taking the captured wagons and food with them. Many of the northern men were smiling now. The attack had been fast, clean, and successful. They had lost very few soldiers, and they had hurt the Lannisters badly. But Jon Snow did not celebrate. He rode quietly at the front, watching the road and the forests around them. Maege Mormont noticed. "You should be proud," she said while riding beside him. "That was a good victory." Jon shook his head slightly. It was only the beginning. Maege looked curious. "What do you mean?" Jon glanced at the smoke rising behind them. "Tywin Lannister will hear about this soon. And he will not ignore it." Maege nodded slowly. "You think he'll send soldiers after us?" "Yes." Jon knew the mind of their enemy. Tywin Lannister was not a man who allowed small attacks to continue. If someone threatened his army, he crushed them quickly. By afternoon, Jon called his captains together. "We change direction," he said. The great Jon's younger brother, who had joined Jon's force, frowned. "Why?" "We're moving well." Jon pointed at the map. "If Tywin sends soldiers to hunt us, they will expect us to keep moving east." Maege understood immediately, "So we go north instead." Jon nodded. "We vanish into the forests." The soldiers quickly changed direction, leaving false tracks heading east, while the real force moved quietly north through thick woodland. 2 days later, a Lannister army arrived at the destroyed camp. Red and gold banners filled the fields. Nearly 8,000 Lannister soldiers stood there, led by a tall knight wearing shining armor, Sir Gregor Clegane. The Mountain. He looked down at the burned wagons with anger. "Who did this?" he growled. A surviving soldier knelt before him. "My lord, Jon Snow." Gregor's massive hand crushed the wooden wagon beside him. "A bastard." He turned toward his captains. "Find him." Scouts rode in every direction, but the trail they followed led east, exactly where Jon wanted them to go. Meanwhile, Jon's army was already moving north. The forests grew thicker and darker, making it difficult for large armies to travel quickly. But Jon had chosen this land carefully. Northern soldiers were used to forests. Southern knights were not. That evening, Jon climbed a hill overlooking a narrow valley. Below them ran a long road between 2 steep forest slopes. Maege joined him. "You found something?" Jon nodded. "If the mountain follows our false trail, his army will come through this valley." Maege studied the area. "And then?" Jon looked at the trees on both sides. "Then we remind them that the North does not fight fair battles." She smiled. "I like unfair battles." Over the next day, the northern soldiers prepared quietly. Archers climbed high into the trees. Heavy rocks and logs were placed along the slopes. Hidden trenches were dug across the road. Everything was done silently. Jon walked among the soldiers, checking every position. Many of them looked at him with new respect now. The bastard commander had already beaten the Lannisters once. Late that night, a scout ran up the hill. "My lord, they're coming." Jon stood still. "How many?" "Thousands. Lannister banners and the Mountain himself." Maege whistled quietly. "That's a big beast walking into our trap." Jon gave calm orders. "No fires tonight. No noise." The northern soldiers waited in darkness. Below them, torches slowly appeared along the road. The Lannister army was marching into the valley. Gregor Clegane rode at the front like a giant monster in armor. His horse alone looked large enough to crush men beneath its hooves. Behind him stretched thousands of soldiers. They believed they were hunting a small northern force. They had no idea they were walking into Jon Snow's trap. Jon watched from the trees above. His face was calm, but his mind was sharp. He raised his hands slowly. The northern archers prepared their arrows. Maege looked at him, ready. Jon nodded once. "Wait until they're deeper." More and more Lannister soldiers filled the valley. The road became crowded with men, horses, and wagons. Finally, Jon lowered his hand. Now. A horn echoed through the forest. In the next second, hundreds of arrows rained down from the trees. Lannister soldiers screamed in surprise. Then massive logs and rocks rolled down the slopes, smashing into the confused army. Horses panicked. Men fell into hidden trenches. Chaos exploded through the valley. And above it all, Jon Snow stood quietly in the dark forest. The wolf had just trapped the lion, and even the mountain was not ready for what came next. The valley exploded with chaos. Arrows rained down from the trees like deadly rain. Lannister soldiers shouted in confusion as rocks and heavy logs rolled down the slopes, smashing through their ranks. Horses screamed and kicked wildly. Men tried to form lines, but the narrow valley trapped them together. Above them, hidden in the dark forest, the northern archers kept firing. Jon Snow stood beside Maester Mormont, watching the battlefield carefully. "Keep the archers firing," he ordered calmly. Another wave of arrows flew down. Below them, Sir Gregor Clegane roared with anger. "Form ranks!" the mountains shouted. Even in chaos, some of the Lannister soldiers began gathering around him. Gregor was massive, almost like a walking wall of steel, and his presence alone forced men to stand and fight. Meg looked down at him. "That monster is rallying them." Jon nodded. "He's stronger than most commanders. If Gregor managed to organize the army, the trap would not last long." Jon turned to one of his captains. "Signal the riders." A horn sounded from the forest behind them. Moments later, northern cavalry burst out of the trees on both sides of the valley. Hundreds of riders charged down the slopes, crashing into the confused Lannister soldiers. Steel clashed loudly. The battle had begun. Maester Mormont led one group, with her axe raised high. "For the north!" she shouted. Jon rode with another group, straight toward the center of the valley. The northern soldiers hit the Lannister army like wolves attacking a wounded animal. Because the valley was narrow, the Lannisters could not spread out. Their numbers became useless. Jon cut through two soldiers quickly as his horse pushed forward. Everywhere around him the battle raged. Swords, shields, arrows, and shouting men. But suddenly the soldiers ahead of Jon moved aside. A giant figure appeared. Sir Gregor appeared. Sir Gregor Clegane. The mountain towered above everyone else. His armor was covered in blood and arrows, but he still stood like an iron wall. His deep voice growled, "You must be the bastard." Jon did not answer. He raised Longclaw. Gregor laughed darkly. "I was hoping it would be you." The mountain lifted his enormous sword and charged. The force of his first strike nearly knocked Jon from his horse. Jon quickly jumped down, realizing fighting Gregor on horseback would be impossible. Steel clashed again. Gregor's strength was terrifying. Each swing of his sword felt like being hit by a hammer. Jon moved quickly, dodging instead of blocking. Gregor swung again, smashing the ground where Jon had stood a second earlier. "You move well for a bastard," Gregor said. Jon stayed silent. He waited for the right moment. Gregor attacked again, slower this time after the heavy swings. Jon stepped to the side and struck quickly, his Valyrian steel sword cutting across Gregor's arm. The mountain growled with pain, but the cut was not deep enough. Gregor slammed his shoulder into Jon, throwing him backward. Jon hit the ground hard. The giant knight stepped closer. "This ends now." But before Gregor could strike again, arrows suddenly flew toward him from the forest. Maester Mormont had seen the fight. 3 arrows hit Gregor's armor, forcing him to step back. Northern soldiers rushed forward to protect Jon. The mountain realized he was surrounded. He growled angrily and mounted his horse again. "Fall back!" he shouted to his soldiers. The Lannister army was already breaking. Too many men had died in the trap, and the narrow valley made escape difficult. Within minutes, the surviving Lannister soldiers began retreating down the road. Jon stood slowly, breathing heavily. "Maege rode over. You nearly died fighting that beast." John wiped blood from his lip. He's strong. Mage looked down the valley, but he ran. All around them, northern soldiers were cheering. The Lannisters are fleeing. The wolves win. The trap had worked perfectly. Thousands of Lannister soldiers had been killed or captured. John looked over the battlefield silently. Victory was theirs. But something else was happening too. The soldiers were looking at him differently now, not just with respect, with belief. A young soldier approached him carefully. "My lord, the men are calling you something." John frowned slightly. "What?" The soldier smiled proudly. "They're calling you the White Wolf." Mage laughed. That's not a bad name." John looked back toward the south, where the Lannisters had fled. Far away, the war was still growing, and Tywin Lannister had now lost supplies and thousands of soldiers. Soon, the Great Lion would realize something terrible. The North had more than one dangerous wolf, and Jon Snow was becoming a legend. The valley slowly became quiet after the battle. The sounds of steel and shouting were gone, replaced by the cold wind moving through the trees. Northern soldiers walked across the battlefield, helping wounded men and gathering the captured weapons. The victory had been huge. Thousands of Lannister soldiers were either dead, captured, or scattered. The Mountain himself had been forced to retreat. But Jon Snow did not celebrate. He stood on a small hill above the valley, looking south where the Lannister army had escaped. Maege Mormont walked up beside him. "The men are celebrating," she said. "You should join them." Jon shook his head slightly. "This battle will make Tywin angry." Maege smiled. "I think he was already angry." Jon finally allowed himself a small smile. But his thoughts were serious. "Tywin Lannister will not send small forces anymore," Jon said. "Next time he will come himself." Maege nodded slowly. "And that will be the real war." Just then, a rider appeared on the road heading toward them. The soldier carried the Stark direwolf banner. "A messenger!" someone shouted. The rider reached Jon and jumped down from his horse. "My Lord Jon," the man said quickly. "Message from King Robb." Jon took the letter and opened it. Maege watched his face as he read. "Well?" she asked. Jon looked up. "Robb defeated Jaime Lannister." Maege's eyes widened. "Seriously?" Jon nodded. "He trapped Jaime's army near River Run. Jaime has been captured." Maege let out a loud laugh. "The Lions are having a terrible week." Around them, the northern soldiers began cheering as the news spread. 2 big victories for the North. But Jon remained serious. Tywin will not ignore this. That evening, Jon gathered his captains around the fire. "We move west," he said. Maege raised an eyebrow. "Toward Robb." Jon nodded. "With Jaime captured, Tywin will rush to save his son." One of the captains frowned. "That means we'll face the main Lannister army." "Yes," Jon said calmly. The soldiers exchanged looks. Everyone knew Tywin Lannister's reputation. He was one of the greatest commanders in the Seven Kingdoms. But Jon continued. "Robb will hold River Run. If Tywin attacks him directly, it will be a massive battle." Maege crossed her arms. "And where do we come in?" Jon pointed to the map again. "We strike Tywin from behind." The captain slowly began to understand. 2 wolves surrounding the lion," Maege said. Jon nodded. "If Tywin fights Robb, his back will be open to us." One captain looked nervous. "But if he sees us coming," Jon replied calmly. "Then we move faster." The next morning, the Northern Army began marching west. Word of Jon Snow's victory had already spread through the soldiers. Many now believed they were following one of the greatest commanders in the war. Some even whispered stories that sounded almost like legends. The White Wolf defeated the Mountain. The White Wolf destroyed thousands of Lannisters. Jon ignored the stories. He only focused on the war. Days later, scouts returned with new information. "My lord," one scout said, "Tywin Lannister is marching with 20,000 soldiers." Maege whistled. That's a big lion. Jon looked at the map, and he's moving toward River Run. The final battle was coming. Far to the west, Robb Stark's army waited near River Run Castle. Thousands of northern soldiers stood ready. Robb sat in his command tent when another messenger arrived. "My king," the man said, "Tywin Lannister's army approaches." Robb nodded slowly. He expected this. Then the messenger added something else. "And Jon Snow's army is also moving toward us from the east." Robb smiled. "My brother is coming." Outside the tent, thousands of soldiers prepared for battle. Meanwhile, Tywin Lannister rode at the head of his massive army. The old lion looked calm, but his mind was working carefully. 2 northern victories had already shocked him. Now he planned to end this war himself. One of his captains rode beside him. "My lord, scouts say Jon Snow may be near." Tywin's eyes narrowed slightly. The bastard commander. He looked toward the western horizon. "Good." The old lion's voice became cold. "Let the wolves come, because very soon the greatest battle of the war would begin. Robb Stark and Jon Snow, 2 wolves, against the most dangerous lion in the 7 kingdoms. And only one side would walk away from that battlefield alive." The fields near River Run were covered with soldiers. Thousands of northern warriors stood ready under their banners, the cold wind moving through their cloaks. Spears, swords, and shields filled the land like a forest of steel. Robb Stark rode slowly along the front of his army. The soldiers watched their young king with respect and pride. Behind him stood the great Jon, Maes Mormont, and many northern lords. But Robb's eyes kept moving toward the eastern road. He was waiting. Finally, in the distance, horns echoed across the plains. The soldiers turned. A second army was approaching. Grey banners with the direwolf of Stark moved through the wind. Jon Snow had arrived. The northern soldiers began cheering loudly. "The White Wolf! The White Wolf!" Jon rode at the front of his army with Longclaw at his side. Beside him rode Maes Mormont and hundreds of riders who had fought with him in the Riverlands. When Jon reached Robb, the 2 brothers stopped their horses. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Robb smiled proudly. "You've been busy." Jon gave a small smile. "So have you." Robb leaned closer. "I heard you fought the Mountain." "He's still alive," Jon said. "For now," Robb replied. The brothers looked across the field where the Lannister army was gathering. Red and gold banners filled the southern hills. Tywin Lannister had arrived. Nearly 20,000 Lannister soldiers stood in perfect formation. Heavy cavalry, armored knights, and disciplined infantry stretched across the land. The lion had come with his full strength. Robb gathered his commanders. "This is the battle Tywin wants," he said. The great Jon grinned. "Good. I've been waiting to break some lions." But Jon studied the battlefield quietly. Tywin's army was larger and better equipped. Fighting them head-on would be dangerous. Jon spoke. "Tywin expects us to attack." Robb nodded. "He always expects that." Jon pointed to a nearby wooded hill. "If we charge straight at him, his cavalry will crush our center." Mage crossed her arms. "So what's the wolf plan?" Jon looked at Robb. "We split again." The great Jon laughed loudly. "You love splitting armies." Jon ignored him and continued. "Robb leads the main force directly at Tywin. He will believe the battle is normal." Robb nodded slowly. "And you?" Jon pointed toward the wooded hill. "My riders move through the forest and strike Tywin's right flank." Meg understood immediately. "You want to break his line." Jon nodded. "If his formation breaks, his numbers won't matter." Robb looked at his brother for a moment. Then he smiled. "Let's do it." The horns of the north sounded across the battlefield. Thousands of northern soldiers began marching forward. Across the field, Tywin Lannister watched from his horse. He saw Robb Stark's army advancing. but his eyes searched the field carefully. "Where is Jon Snow?" he asked quietly. A captain answered, "My lord, he may be with Robb's riders." Tywin did not look convinced. That bastard had already surprised him twice. The battle began with thunder. Northern soldiers crashed into the Lannister lines with a roar of steel and shouting men. Robb Stark led the charge at the center, his sword flashing as the wolves slammed into the lions. The Great Jon fought beside him like a giant storm, but Tywin remained calm. "Send the cavalry," he ordered. Hundreds of Lannister knights charged forward. The battlefield became a storm of hooves and steel. For a moment it seemed the Lannisters might push the North back. Then suddenly horns echoed from the forest. Tywin turned his head sharply. Out of the trees exploded hundreds of northern riders. Jon Snow led them at full speed. The White Wolf had arrived. His cavalry smashed directly into the Lannister flank. The sudden attack broke the Lannister formation instantly. Soldiers fell, horses crashed, and confusion spread through the line. Tywin realized the danger immediately. "Reform the right flank," he shouted, but it was too late. Jon's riders moved like wolves hunting prey, fast, precise, deadly. With the flank collapsing, Robb's army pushed harder from the front. The Lannister line began to break. Tywin watched the battlefield carefully. For the first time in the war, the Great Lion understood something. He was not fighting one dangerous Stark. He was fighting two. Robb Stark, the warrior king, and Jon Snow, the commander who thought like a wolf. As the Lannister soldiers began retreating, northern cheers filled the battlefield. The wolves had won. When the fighting finally ended, Robb rode toward Jon. The two brothers looked over the battlefield together. "You were right," Robb said. Jon shook his head. "We were right. The North had won its greatest victory, and across the Seven Kingdoms, people would soon hear a new story. Not just about the king in the North, but about the bastard who became his greatest commander, Jon Snow."